Hello and welcome to another installment of Beards and Cars Rivals, and for those who are maybe newer to the channel or to the series, we take two or more vehicles and pit them in a head-to-head showdown to find out not just which one has the better lap time on the Nürburgring or which one has more power or can do better wheel spins or get sideways on camera, but what they actually like to live with for somebody who genuinely wants to buy one and can't quite decide which they want more, which they like more, or even which one is better suited to their circumstances and needs. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a clearer idea. And a game that I like to play with the viewer, if you want to play along, is maybe get your idea of which one you initially prefer, and then review that at the end of the video based on what I've said, and see if you still feel the same way, or if maybe something that I've said has perhaps changed your mind or opened up a newer option. Now, in terms of knowing where we are visually within the video, the car with the wood interior and the black paint is the older shape, an X100, and that's probably how I'll refer to it in the video most of the time. The silver car with the black interior, no wood, is the X150 shape, the newer car, but also I chose to use, visually speaking, a 4.2, which is the earlier of the newer shaped Jags. And that, for a reference, is actually the one that I bought. Not this exact car, I bought a black one, but that was the shape that I purchased, so my personal preference is fairly obvious. Now, what do you need to know about these generations initially in terms of what you get, which one should you buy, depending on if you do prefer new or old? Well, there are two shapes of XKR. And even though I'm going to focus in mainly on the XKR, you can apply a lot of this to the XK8, the naturally aspirated versions, even higher models like the XKRS or the GT, even in the case of the newer one. You could even apply it to the 5 litre if you wanted to. This is a general salvo to give you an idea. So, there are two shapes. You've got the X100, which is the torpedo or cigar-shaped car, more of a classic look, kind of like a modern-day E-Type. And then you've got the X150, the newer silver car, which I wod say has more of an Aston DB9 or a DBS kind of shape. Now, of course, mechanically, the older one shares more in common with the DB7. The newer one was designed, if I recall correctly, by the same guy that actually did design the DB9, so it makes sense that it would look fairly similar. And actually you should consider 3 generations within each of these. The first car came about in 1998. It came with a 4-litre engine and a 5-speed Mercedes ZF gearbox. Then in 2002, they upped it to a 4.2-litre with around 400 horsepower, and also a 6-speed gearbox from ZF. Then in 2004, there's the most notable visual change, where it had a much more different front end, as you'll probably see here from a visual reference on screen. Same essential 400 horsepower engine, same gearbox, values are higher, performance is similar, but that's the general overview. So 4-litre, 4.2, and then the full facelift 4.2. Spanning basically 1998 to 2006. Then the second shape car, the second generation, if you will, the X150, actually came around in 2007. Some of the naturally aspirated cars you'll sometimes see in 2006, but the XKR officially is a 2007 car. Started off in this form, the silver one, 4.2, 420 horsepower, just like the one that I owned. Then in 2009, we have the period that a lot of people kind of miss, even aficionados, and that is that in 2009, there was kind of a Frankenstein car. They put the newer 5-litre 503 horsepower engine into it, but it still had the older 4.2's looks. The older headlights, still had the side blades, etc. Even the interior was mostly unchanged. Then in 2011, we had the final of the final shape. Full facelift, 5-litre engine, rotary gear selector instead of the old school one, the full final phase of the Jag XKR, which technically ended in 2014, but you can find a couple that are registered more like 2015, and that's the last you can find. So that's the overview. Older one, 4-litre 4.2 facelift, newer one, 4.2 5-litre 5-litre facelift. So there's a lot to choose from, and that's just XKRs. That's not special editions, that's not naturally aspirated, that's not S models. So now what do you need to know about which one could be better for you? Well, let's keep it simplified again and just refer to it as X100 versus X150. The older shaped car's biggest disadvantage is the space. Even if you're a shorter driver, you will notice a distinctly more snug cabin, and I've mentioned as such in my dedicated review for that car. And incidentally, if you want to hear more about either of these cars in a more strict solo sense, then look right below this video in the description, and there are links there to my individual road test reviews to each of them if you just want to hear more about the cars in general as well. So the older car's biggest disadvantage potentially, certainly for me as a bigger driver, and even just in general, is the space. The rear seats have virtually no legroom whatsoever, and even though they're technically there, you can barely use them. The older car is not a hatchback, so you have no rear access. It's a separate notchback trunk. Kind of more traditional in that sense. The newer car brought in the hatchback trunk, which I personally prefer, the hatchback boot I should say for us in the UK. I've always liked that feature. It has a more obvious level of boot space. I wouldn't say that the luggage space is necessarily better, it's just different. The older car is a little bit deeper and you can fit more into the car, whereas the newer car has more easy access loading, a wider, deeper space, but it's a bit shallower. I should say deeper in terms of the length of the trunk, but it's not quite as deep. I think you know what I mean though. Rear seats are a little bit better on the newer car, but not by much, to be honest. I've had people in the back occasionally, but they weren't comfortable. In the driver's seat though, massive difference. Partially because the newer car has very, very different actual proportions to the older one. Apart from the obvious fact that the cabin is just a little bit further back on the newer car, it's 2.5 inches or so wider, 6.5 inches longer, and despite all that, actually weighs about 200 pounds or 90 kilos less than the car which it replaced. So across the board, it's impressive in that regard. In terms of its raw dimensions, add on top of that the fact that you've got 20 horsepower more torque as well. It goes without saying, but I can confirm every single version of the XK, XKR, XKRS, whichever you want to talk about, the newer one is always quicker. That shouldn't surprise you, but I can confirm that that is the case. If you compare the naturally aspirated to the naturally aspirated, the R to the R, the newer one is faster every time. So there's no argument there. If you're looking purely for performance, you should 100% go for the newer car. In terms of driver space, I touched on the fact that the older one is more cramped. The newer one is the polar opposite, and it's one of the things I love the most about it. I guarantee if you're 6'7", 6'8", you can still fit in the newer car. You literally have that much legroom to work with, and even though it's a really low slung car, you've got so much driver room in terms of tilting the seat back, moving away from the wheel, and still feeling that you are never cramped for space. The rear seats are a totally different story, but for the passengers up front, you've got more space than you could ever need, and it's fantastic in that regard, to the point where I would never live with an X100, even if I loved the rest of the car, because it would simply be too uncomfortable for me. I never had any complaints whatsoever in that regard, as the driver at least, when it comes to the newer car. So in terms of performance, it's a clear win for the newer one. In terms of driver space, it's unarguably a win for the newer one. In terms of trunk space, it could go either way. I may even give the point to the older one, perhaps, in terms of having a more useful boot or trunk, whereas the newer one, it has the hatchback access, so, you know, depends on if you want that. And if you go for the convertible, of course, that'll change anyway. In terms of driving feel, let's talk handling, first of all. The older car is, without question, more charming to drive. It has more of an old school British feel to it. It feels like driving a piece of history, even though it's not actually that old. The downside to that is that by definition it means it's softer, it's not as precise, it's a bit more wallowy through corners, and even on straight roads it still feels a little bit more floaty over the front end. You add some rain or mud to the mix and you're going to have a car that is, under hard conditions especially, more of a handful. The newer car is, as I said, lighter, it's wider and longer, so it feels more squat and has more of a supercar stance, and you can immediately feel the difference. Even if you compare the base model of the newer car to the top of the range older car, I would still give the edge to the newer one in terms of just handling physics. It feels so good through corners. Now, with that being said, I'm not saying that the newer car feels like a, Mitsubishi Evo going through any wet puddle like it's this grippy, endlessly rally car kind of machine. Of course not. You go through a puddle with the right or wrong, depending on how you look at it, set of tyres, you're going to feel the steering pull a little bit, but it's nowhere near as much as on the older car. most of the time I would 100% give the edge to the newer car. The newer car is also incidentally known for being really forgiving if you do like to hoon it around corners and get the tail out. The car is notorious for being really, really good in that regard. In terms of ride quality though, this is where the older car pays off, because if you're looking for a longer distance tourer, I have to, in good faith, give it to the X100. That older shaped car, because it's softer, because it's not as precise and it's a little bit more wallowy, the payoff is that it does soak up bumps in the road just a little bit better. Now, I want to clarify that by saying I don't think the improvement in ride quality is enough to justify that being the choice that you make, but it is a factor. So in other words, I'm not saying one feels like a Caterham and one feels like a Rolls Royce. It's not that kind of difference. They're both comfortable, but there is a slight edge. I may give it maybe a 15 to 20% advantage. So not a huge one, but that's the kind of difference I would say. What then in terms of values? Well, when it comes to value, the XK is up and down all over the place. Currently in the UK, values are going up, especially on the newer cars, and generally speaking, much like with the performance, each variation is always going to be cheaper on the older car. Now, that may sound like an obvious thing to say, but I could actually see that changing at a certain point. When one car becomes more of a bona fide classic, then that could well change. We're not quite at that point yet though, and consequently the older cars are still cheaper. Now, there may be some places in the world where that's different, but here in the UK that is the way it is. And as a rough guide, I'm just going to talk entry point prices. The original 4 litre of the older shape, from 1998 onwards, you should be looking to pay at least £6,000. And when I say at least, all of these are like for high mileage cars that aren't in the greatest condition. So I'm not talking about like perfect prices, I'm just talking entry level at every stage. £6,000. When they updated it to the 4.2, so around a 2002 car, you should be looking at least £8,000. Then in 2004, for that beginning of the end, for the first shape with the full facelift, the newer engine, 400 horsepower, you should be looking at a minimum of £10,000. And that's literally for like a 6-figure mileage car, but still not too bad a price. Then for the newer car, for like a 2007-ish, you should look at least £12,000. Then for a 2009, where it has the older shape looks, but the newer 5-litre engine, you're looking at least £15,000. So a bit more of a jump. And then the biggest jump is if you go for anything after 2011. The full facelift, 5-litre engine, even if it's not something crazy like an XKRS, just an XKR, you're looking at realistically like £25,000, because most of them don't have crazy miles at that point, because they're so much newer and it's so much more of a pure sports car experience, even more so you could say than a GT, then that keeps the values higher. And in fact, if you're willing to go for an ultra low mileage model, like the last of the last 2014, 2015 Rs, you can comfortably pay up to like £50,000, if not more, and that's just in the UK. And I'm aware that sometimes import taxes and various other taxes, or just values in general, make them even crazier in other countries, but we're just using the UK as the standard here. So overall, as you'd expect, each variation goes up in price, and every single time the newer one is more of an entry point cost than the older one. So it's interesting how it keeps going back and forth between the two. If you're looking for cheapness, the older one has the edge. If you're looking for comfort, if you're looking for more of a classic vibe, well, in all of these ways the older car is better. If you're looking for the better handling, the better stability, more driver space, better performance, then the newer car is without question for you. Currently, if you're looking for a car that will keep more of its value and be, at least according to the current market, on more of an upturn, then once again, interestingly, the newer car is the one for you. And somewhat counterintuitively, actually the newest of the new are currently the ones that are increasing in value the most, because those are the ones that are the most sought after. I could see that changing over time, but for now at least, while the mileage on some of those is still relatively low, those values are really strong, as I said earlier on. So ultimately, I know I haven't been as technical in this breakdown as I often am, you know, this horsepower, that torque, this miles per gallon, that per tank, but for this particular showdown, I don't think that's as necessary. Because this is more of an overview discussion, there are so many more factors to consider, and I wanted to touch on those. Now, the final one, of course, is reliability and what it's like to live with them. Many of those things have already been mentioned. Even in terms of fuel economy and road tax, those things aren't that much different between the new and the old. Fuel economy wise, they're not that much different because they share similar engines. Now, in terms of reliability, this is where things get different, because as a number of comments on the channel have weighed in on, and I welcome those comments down below in this video as well, it seems that generally speaking the least reliable one is the original 4-litre from the 90s. I'm sure there are people who would disagree with that, but that seems to be the consensus from at least the people who own or have owned those. Take that as you will. The 4.2 engine from then on, when they updated it in around 2002, you could argue didn't change a massive amount even when they facelifted the car. So the 4.2, generally speaking, spanning from let's say 2002 to about 2008, between two different entirely shaped vehicles, it's a pretty safe bet. In fact, overall, myself in the one that I chose, and a lot of other people in, for instance, the owners forums will chances are agree with me that the 4.2 is the safest one to go for in terms of reliability and also not being too expensive to fix. It's a fairly old school kind of muscle car-esque engine, but in the best ways. Plus it's kind of all torque, which suits the car down to a T, and you barely ever get above 4,000 RPM. Then you've got pure performance. The 5-litre in any form, even the base model naturally aspirated, is a beast of an engine. The least powerful version of that has 385 horsepower, and that's just the XK. As I've said in my review for that car, it's fantastic. It's a gorgeous car. In fact, I like that one more than the R version with the 5-litre engine. So again, when it comes to the choice of engine, it depends of course on what you want and what you need and what your budget is, but also that's a general idea of what you should expect. The 5-litre isn't an unreliable engine, but it is known to have certain issues which plague it a little bit more. And again, I'm not going to get into the super technical nuts and bolts of every single issue that these cars can have, but if you want to know more of specific issues, look down in the comments for those dropped by people who have owned those, and absolutely join those owners clubs and forums as well to get into the nitty-gritty stuff, which would just get too boring to hear in a video. Overall though, that's generally what you should know. Seems that the 4-litre isn't that great, probably the weakest of them all. 4.2s overall are a strong bet, the safest bet, and then the 5-litre has by far the best performance and sheer numbers, but maybe is a little bit more temperamental than the 4.2. Some would probably even say a lot more temperamental. I know there are one or two engineering changes that were made that some people aren't a fan of. In terms of interior design and the kind of kit that you get, the shape and the style of each car doesn't change that much within its respective time frame. The major changes tend to be in the case of the older car. You notice that in the center of the vehicle over time it went from having dials to more of a smaller, not quite touch screen, but like a digital display as it moved into the 2000s. And then on the newer car, the biggest visual difference is of course the gear selector change. Myself, I much prefer the old style clunk into place shifter, one of the reasons why I bought mine. Then even in 2009 when they gave it that 5-litre update, some of those still came with the old shifter, and then after that they moved into the rotary style shifter, which my thoughts are out there on the channel about that. I'm not a huge fan. I love it in the XFR, but to me it just doesn't suit the XKR. But again, it's down to you and what you want. In terms of pure kit, well, they're fairly similar. The kind of stuff that you expect to find in the car isn't going to change that much. It's not like one has a built-in mini fridge and the other doesn't. They are essentially both 2+2 GTs. One's a hatch, one isn't, one has slightly more power, etc. So the level of what you offer, or what the car offers and what you get as the buyer, doesn't change radically. What does change is the kind of personality, the kind of character, and the raw performance, and crucially the way that they deliver the performance. That is where the change comes. As I alluded to earlier on, the older car has more of a rolling on effect of performance. It's lazier, it's more of a really powerful cruiser, it's softer, it's more mellow. It can drive fast, but it feels like it would rather be a cruiser. The newer one is sharper, it's lighter on its feet, more of a supercar stance, it's more playful, but I would argue is just as capable as being just a cruiser, something that people love to look at, and they really do love to look at it. Ultimately, either way, you're going to have a fantastic car in your hands. Of course, they can have their issues, and again, any car can, but in terms of what they offer for the money, Well, simply compare it to its rivals. There isn't much else that can rival it without adding at least another 10 grand on top. Something like a TVR Tuscan, or an Audi R8, or a Bentley Conti GT, or even a Porsche 911. Not much can match it. Even something like an Aston DB7 base models, you're looking at like XKR 5-litre money just for a 300 horsepower DB7. So it doesn't really compare. The only thing that really comes close is maybe something like a Maserati Gran Turismo, and of course I've purchased a Maserati again myself and traded in my Jag for it, so that kind of shows that I have the confidence to do that. So if you want to look at more than just Jags, I have actually done that showdown between an XKR and a Maserati Gran Turismo. Beyond that, there's not much else which really rivals it that well. Ultimately, that's it for my thoughts. Slap yours down below, and of course, I hope this video helps you in making your choice. But ultimately, I'll see you next time. Be sure to check out the channel for a lot more content. I've done exhaust swaps on mine, putting spacers on it, reviewing it basically every version of the 4 primary, 4.2 and 5 litres, the older one, XJRs, S-Types, XFRs, all kind of Jag content. And of course, check those out in Beards and Cars. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.